Our lesson for Sunday, November the 15th, is entitled, "The Only Way Up is Down." The key verse is Mark 10:45, which says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The scripture is from Mark 10, verses 32 through 45. The lesson focus is we follow a leader who serves. The overview says, as Jesus and his disciples made their way toward Jerusalem, he predicted his death for the third time. Realizing that something important was about to happen, James and John pulled Jesus aside and asked a special favor, that he would allow them to have the places of highest honor in the kingdom. Even though he didn't grant their request, the rest of the disciples became angry with James and John. That was when Jesus taught them all the most important principle regarding his kingdom, that greatness would not be found in position or power, but in servanthood. And his very life would serve as a model for them to follow. The introduction asks, how do you define greatness? Every year, Time magazine names their Person of the Year, the person who, for better or worse, most impacted the world in the previous 12 months. Political parties define greatness by power. Hollywood defines greatness by the person who draws the biggest box office gain at the theater, or by who gains the most awards for their performance. The NFL defines greatness by who can win the Super Bowl, and Major League Baseball by who can win the World Series. The corporate world defines it by who can make the most money. There is a general tendency to view greatness from the top down through a lens of power, fame, or money. Jesus, on the other hand, views it from the bottom up, through the lens of servanthood. That was a lesson Jesus had to teach the disciples by example. Part 1 says Jesus predicted his own death, and the text is from Mark 10, verses 32 through 34, which says, "They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. 'We are going up to Jerusalem,' he said, 'and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise.'" Jesus and his disciples were making their way along the road from Galilee up to Jerusalem. The time of the Passover was approaching. The disciples were astonished as they reflected on all that had transpired leading up to this, and they knew that something amazing was about to happen. The rest of the people who were following them, however, were afraid. Ominous clouds of danger were gathering on the horizon. Jesus pulled the 12 aside from the others on the journey and warned them about what was going to happen when they arrived. Twice previously he had predicted his impending death, but this time he was much more specific. He told them, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They already knew the chief priests and teachers of the law were out to get Jesus. That was no surprise. But delivered over, that meant someone who loved him would ultimately turn on him, perhaps one of them. The chief priests and teachers of the law, the Sanhedrin, Israel's Supreme Court, would condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles. At this time in history, the Jewish leaders were powerless to execute a death sentence. They needed the authority of the occupying Romans. The Romans, in turn, would mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. And the disciples didn't need to wonder how. Roman crosses frequently dotted the landscape, showing Rome's displeasure with those they considered to be troublemakers. But as he had done each time previously, Jesus also gave his disciples a note of hope. 3 days later he will rise. His death would not be the end of the story. One has to wonder, though, in light of their despair, following his death, whether those words even registered. Part 2 says James and John uttered a selfish request, and the text is from Mark 10, verses 35 through 40, which says, Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, Let one of us sit at your right and the other sit at your left in your glory. You don't know what you are asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. Realizing that Jesus was about to do something dramatic in respect to inaugurating his kingdom, James and John took him aside to ask him a special request. These two were part of Jesus' inner circle. They even wanted him to do for them whatever they asked without him knowing specifically what it was. Jesus had told them to ask whatever they would in his name, and he would grant it. But their request sounded more like it was in their name instead of his. They seemed to have been approaching him in the way we would perceive a magic genie or Santa Claus. Jesus asked them what they wanted him to do for them. He asked the same from us, for in the asking, our motives, like theirs, often come to the surface. Their request was bold. Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. Unfortunately, they still did not understand the nature of Christ's kingdom. They, like many Jews in their day, thought it would be an earthly kingdom. As two of his closest disciples, they hoped they might have the privilege of sitting in the two most honored seats in his royal court. They wanted power and prestige, but not only so, they even wanted it over the rest of the disciples. Jesus told them they really didn't understand what they were asking. He inquired of them, Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? To request the positions of highest honor meant also to request deep suffering, for they could not have one without the other. The cup to which he referred to was the same cup he would mention in his prayer in Gethsemane, where he said, Take this cup from me. It was a cup of suffering from which he would have to drink in order to bring salvation to the world. The baptism he referred to was an Old Testament metaphor for a person being overwhelmed by suffering. Jesus and John told Jesus they were indeed able. They were willing to follow him whatever the cost. The sons of thunder were willing to fight whatever battle was waiting for them. So Jesus told them they would indeed drink his cup and be baptized with his baptism. James eventually died as a martyr, put to death by the sword. John lived through many years of persecution before he was finally exiled to the barren island of Patmos. Many other followers of Christ would also follow them, and the cup and baptism would eventually become common symbols within the church as new believers would identify with the suffering and death of Christ through the rite, Eucharist, and baptism. In the end, the brother's request was not one Jesus could grant. His Father had already determined who would have that honor. He could not grant special favors. He didn't ridicule them for their requests, but he denied it. He does not always grant all of the requests we ask for either. He wants to give us what is best for us, not merely what we want. Part 3 says, Greatness is found in servanthood, and the text is from Mark 10, verses 41 through 45, which says, When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. When the other disciples caught wind of what James and John had asked Jesus, they became indignant with them. Perhaps it was Peter, the odd man out of the inner three, who led in the protest. Just as Jesus' ministry was drawing to a close, his disciples appeared to be unraveling out of petty jealousy toward one another. Jesus, always seeing the teachable moment, called for a team meeting. He wanted them to see that there was a vast difference between the world's way of leading and that of leadership in his kingdom. The rulers of the Gentiles, he noted, lorded their authority over those beneath them. The disciples knew all about that. That was the model of greatness they had readily observed for Israel at the moment, struggling under the heavy hand of Roman oppression. But the disciples were not living in that kingdom under those rules. Instead, Jesus noted, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Jesus' kingdom operated by a completely different set of rules. No one ruled from the top down, they ruled from the bottom up. He used the image of a household servant and a slave to show them that the highest value in his kingdom was placed on humility, unlike the rest of the world. Servants and slaves aren't afraid to get dirty. They don't shy away from the hard work. They don't keep track of who did what or why. They don't look down on anyone because of rank or position, because they are already on the lowest rung. They simply do their duty, serving others sacrificially. That is, in fact, what Jesus did. He did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He was the Son of God, but as the Son of Man, he took on the role of a servant. And that was precisely the attitude he expected his followers to emulate. Paul would later write, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. His life was not taken from him. He gave it up willingly to pay the price to rescue us from our bondage to sin. The disciples had thought Jesus' life and power would rescue them from Rome, but instead it rescued them from a tyranny that was even greater. And because he willingly took the lowest place, God raised him to take the highest seat in the kingdom. Today's life application says, servanthood is generally not found in the grand and noble things we do, but in the simple, everyday stuff of life. It is most readily seen in our relationships with those we live among each day. How might Jesus want you, as one of his disciples, to take on the role of a servant with your spouse, your friends, your children, your boss, your co-workers, your neighbors, or your fellow church members?